My talk this evening is called Ethical Magic or Magical Ethics on Being an Occultist. First, we should take a look at what occultism actually is. According to Annie Besant, quoting Madame Blavatsky, occultism is the study of the divine mind in nature. What then is the divine mind? I think of it as the source of our universe, all beings within it, and the evolutionary plan that propels us on a journey back to oneness with this source. And in that definition of occultism as the study of the divine mind in nature, nature is the universe, the beings, and the plan. What then is an occultist? Perhaps obviously one who studies the divine mind in nature. But how can we do this? I think of it in terms of the three objects of the Theosophical Society. So, for example, we can study the divine mind in nature as an expression of universal brotherhood, which is our first object. We can also study it as the divine mind in nature as the goal and synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, our second object. And we can study it as the correlation of known and unknown laws of nature and their agents with latent and patent human powers, which is our third object. A latent power, of course, is one that hasn't developed yet. A patent is one that is fully developed. And I'd like to highlight this word agents because one of the aspects of the third object that I think is not enough stressed or understood is that the laws of nature have non-physical beings behind them called nature spirits and devas. Deva is a Sanskrit word meaning shining one, and it refers to gods or what we would call angels in Western culture. But let's look a little more deeply at this third object of the Theosophical Society. The literal wording is to investigate unknown laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. When I gave my talk to the International Convention last December, the talk entitled Theosophical Resilience in the Mind of a Master, I said, all laws of nature and all latent powers in humanity have their origin and explanation in the one self. The investigation of the one self in all is the true goal of our third object. And my talk this evening is an extension of this set of sentences. So, what is evolution in this context? I like to think of it in terms of Annie Besant's definition in the Ancient Wisdom. Evolution may be summed up in a phrase. It is latent potentialities becoming active powers. What this means to me is that these potentialities and powers are aspects of the divine mind. Thus, evolution may be thought of as both a journey back to oneness with the divine mind and as the realization within ourselves of the powers of the divine mind. What are those powers of the divine mind? Traditionally, they're talked about as omnipotence, which means all power, omnipresence, which means all presence or being everywhere at once, and omniscience, which means having all knowledge, especially the knowledge of what's going on inside all of the beings of the universe. But let's go a little deeper into these powers. I also like to think of omnipotence as being the source of all powers and laws. And this could be called the transcendent aspect of God, God outside the universe, creating the universe. With omnipresence, I like to think of it as being present for all beings and needs. And that's the immanent aspect of God, God within the universe, God as the being, the force that embraces everything in the universe. And then with omniscience, I think of it as the creating and the moving within and between, in other words, knowing all the systems and parts of the universe, the matter, the planes, and the bodies. And this could be thought of as the imprisoned or matter-bound aspect of God. This idea of the transcendent, the immanent, and the imprisoned aspects of God comes from a wonderful book by I.K. Taimni, a theosophist who wrote a book called Man, God, and the Universe. So now let's bring occultism and theosophy into relationship with one another. We can think of occultism as the study of omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience as expressions of the divine mind, evolving toward their realization by gradual assimilation with the divine mind. And by assimilation with, I mean becoming ever more like. Studying God knowledge, which is the literal translation of the word theosophy, with the goal of becoming ever more godlike. That's what I mean by gradual assimilation with the divine mind. In some of our literature, however, we see this phrase, becoming a god, and I consider that phrase misleading and possibly dangerous, because it leads to the idea of power over others and perhaps a kind of selfish pride and arrogance. So becoming ever more godlike, I think, is preferable to saying becoming a god. So now let's move from occultism to the subject of ethics. What is ethics? Annie Besant has defined ethics along the lines of what I'm about to say, the principle of unity and the practice of non-harming based on the notion that we are all one in the divine mind. This is a paraphrase of some of the things that she says in a wonderful book called Sanatana Dharma, an advanced textbook of Hindu religion and ethics from 1903. There's quite a wonderful long section on ethics and morality from a Hindu, but also certainly from a theosophical perspective that I highly recommend for those who are interested in the subject. I think of ethics as how we evolve toward the realization of omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience by assimilating ourselves to the divine mind. This could be called a specifically theosophical form of ethics. I think by the end of my talk, you'll understand why I say specifically theosophical, but the idea that ethics is our experience of or our aspiring to oneness in the divine mind, that is clearly a theosophical tenet. What is oneness? So in reading that book, Sanatana Dharma, I came up with an idea that I call the ladder of inclusion, which I'll be explaining to you in the next couple of slides. What this means is evolving in tolerance and compassionate understanding through the following stages. We begin as a self. We learn to have a friend. We learn to develop partnership, which could be a business partnership, or it could be a life mate. That's very low, so to speak, on the ladder of inclusion, but it's a beginning because it's a movement away from self. From self and partner, especially life mate, we can move to family, and then we've got a nuclear family, perhaps including a couple and children, and extended families that can include grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, and so on. So this tolerance towards family is a step higher on the ladder of inclusion. From there, we move to community, and the things I have listed here are not hierarchical in nature. They're simply suggestions of a number of different possible communities that we can belong to. A local community such as our neighbors, a social community of people who think in a like-minded way and are probably about the same age, an occupational community such as you experience in the workplace, a political community, or a religious and spiritual community. From those communities, we might grow in tolerance and compassionate understanding for what's going on in our city, our state, our region, our nation. These are hierarchically arranged in ever larger realms, you could say, of inclusiveness. And of course, the goal eventually is to become inclusive, tolerant of humanity and the world. And this is an area of a great deal of struggle and a lot of conversation these days, involving race, color, gender and sexuality, body type even, and generation, in other words, the age of people, whether younger people or mature people or older people, ethnicity and culture, language, creed, and caste. Some of those words you'll recognize from our first object of universal brotherhood, but I don't really think those words cover the whole ground of what we are learning in order to achieve the ladder of inclusion at the step of humanity and the world. And from there, as Annie Besant puts it, we move to inhabitants of the physical planet or plane, which include mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms. In the theosophical teachings, even minerals, even soils, even gemstones or crystals or rocks all have a certain degree of consciousness and are all involved in an evolutionary progress towards oneness with the source. And then we can think about something that wasn't really talked about by Annie Besant, but I think is very current these days, and that is the interdependence of ecosystems and climates. And these also can be arranged locally. We have local ecosystems and climates, regional ones, oceanic ones, hemispheric ones, and world ones. And I'm thinking not so much in terms of the effect of human beings on the climate and on ecosystems as in pollution and that sort of thing. Not that alone, but also the interdependence that we see, for example, in the Amazon rainforest, where the fungi in that rainforest send out spores that get lofted into the air and become aerosols that raindrops form around, creating thunderstorms that then feed water to the rainforest to keep it going. So that's an example of an interdependence of ecosystems within a particular part of the world. And probably these systems exist everywhere, and we may be largely ignorant of them. So certainly on this ladder of inclusion, we need to include this awareness of interdependence of ecosystems and climates. And then again, Annie Besant adds that with this ladder of inclusion, we also need to be tolerant of the inhabitants of non-physical planes. And this can include nature spirits, angels and devas, even deceased humans, such as our ancestors. What does Annie Besant have to say on oneness? Spirituality is the realization of unity, the seeing of the oneness of all things, the seeing one life, one consciousness, one existence alike in the dust of the earth and in the highest archangel, in God himself. So you see, we start with the dust of the earth, we end with an archangel. That is the ladder of inclusion. She goes on, nothing higher is possible for humanity than this realization of the oneness of all. It is the basis of morality. So, as I mentioned, morality involves the practice of non-harming, which is the English translation of a Sanskrit word, ahimsa. I think of ahimsa, of non-harming, as thought, speech, and action that is both right and true as an expression of oneness, both useful and beneficial, in other words, for the greater good, both tolerant and kind to oneself and to others, and both fitting and necessary. In other words, it will promote wholeness and healing within and between oneself and others. Besant talked about theosophical morality in the advanced textbook that I mentioned earlier, and this is what she said, that it involves recognizing the unity of the self, establishing mutually helpful relations between all separated selves, in other words, all beings that experience themselves as within the container of a body, practicing universal love as an expression of unity, the root of all virtues, recognizing love's opposite, hate, as the root of all vices, and then transforming vices into virtues. So there we have Besant's idea of theosophical morality. So having covered the subject of ethics, let's now bring in the question of what is magic? I define magic as the focused power of human will working with, or unfortunately sometimes against, the evolutionary plan in the divine mind. With means so-called white or light magic, which I prefer to think of as unitive or constructive magic. This is non-harming and for the benefit of all. Against means so-called black or dark magic, which I prefer to call disruptive or destructive magic. And this tends to be harming and for the benefit of self alone. Now, this idea of white magic versus black magic is very old in terms of Western esotericism. And some people have tried to move in the direction of light magic for white and dark magic for black, but it isn't really that much better. There's an implied colonialism, I am afraid, in both of these attempts to talk about the upside and the downside of magic, so to speak, where white is preferred to black and light is preferred to dark. And unfortunately, this too often gets applied to people's skin color. In theosophical literature from the earlier periods, whenever it's reprinted, you'll see an asterisk that says, not a reference to race. But I very much wish that we could replace these terms. And I'm constantly thinking of possible ways to do it, but I think unitive or constructive magic versus disruptive or destructive magic is probably a useful possible way forward. What then is ethical magic? Focusing the power of the human will on promoting oneness with and non-harming of all beings, whether less, equally, or more evolved than we are. Now that phrase is tricky too, because it could imply a kind of colonialism. But if we think of it as where we stand on the ladder of inclusion, I think you'll understand what I mean. The people who are able to embrace within their consciousness a tolerance and a compassionate treatment of the entire world of all living beings, physical and non-physical, those would have to be a very advanced form of human being. In other words, what we call spiritual masters. Whereas the less evolved might be the beings that, the individuals that are really only focused on self or self and family. Now, that's not to say that we should judge them in any way. If we're truly to be tolerant at some higher level of the ladder of inclusion, we need to understand that they're learning what they need to learn at a level of development that we've been through too, and that we may have passed beyond. No judgment is implied. If we can help them in any way, certainly we will do that. So, focusing the power of the human will on promoting oneness with and non-harming of all beings, whether less, equally, or more evolved than we are, in cooperation with the evolutionary plan of the divine mind and collaboration with its agents. That's what I mean by ethical magic. And the beings at the top of the line, so to speak, the spiritual masters and the devas and the angels are definitely more evolved than we are. And they're the ones who act as our guides in cooperation with this evolutionary plan. So what then is magical ethics? I consider it to be an ethical system, placing our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual powers in right relationship with the evolutionary plan of the divine mind, allowing these powers to develop in service, for the greater good of all. And occultism, as taught in Theosophy, is such a system of magical ethics. So at this point, I'm going to be talking about some things I've been thinking about and teaching, writing about, and lecturing about that are based on the psychic and spiritual development classes that I've taught for over 20 years. And there will be a direct tie-in with Theosophical teachings coming in some later slides. So whether we're in physical reality or non-physical reality, we have outer senses, we have inner senses, and some of us have a receptivity to what I call inner sense data. And that receptivity tends to take the form of three different, what I call psychic types. Someone more or less specializes in one of these types. And I consider them to be energy, consciousness, and information. What I mean by energy is the feeling of the truth of something, just an energy that you know you're in relationship with the source or with some higher level of reality. Or with consciousness, the experience of relationship. That's the most important thing. Or with information, imagery is the most important thing. I happen to be one of those image types. I'm a prolific dreamer, for example. Not everybody is. I think about these three types as mystic, empath, and seer. And each one of them comes with the possibility of developing a specific kind of so-called psychic or spiritual ability. With mystics, it's clairsentience, which is the ability to experience, to feel the different energy states or consciousness states of beings and situations. With empaths, it's clairaudience, which means the ability to sense into or hear the needfulness, the suffering of other beings. And then with the seer, it's clairvoyance, which is the ability to perceive other beings and the environments in which they live, for example, the astral plane. I'll go into more detail in the next few slides about what these powers mean. So, clairsentience for mystics, clear feeling, in other words, is the ability to receive inner sense data in terms of energy/truth or powers/laws, which are expressions of energy/truth. The word for this, which is not a very well-known word these days, is psychometry, which literally means soul measuring. Psyche, soul, and ometry, as in geometry, measuring. So what happens for mystics is they have this ability to measure the soul of things, which could be the dharma of other people, dharma being a word that represents the beingness of someone, their goal in life, their life purpose, the truth of who they are, their spiritual path. Also, to feel the energy states present in groups, whether they're safe or unsafe. I call these energy states value fields. So for example, if you go into a theosophical meeting and people have been meditating, you can directly feel that a value field has been created and that it's a safe, supported field. Whereas you can go into environments where things are much more chaotic. And if there are no values or the values tend to be crass or commercial, they may not be safe places. Also, another thing mystics can experience through clairsentience is the sacredness or the woundedness of places and objects. A sacred place would be a temple or a church. A sacred object would be something you use in a ritual. A wounded place is something like a battlefield. People can have the sensitivity to the trauma in a landscape where a battle occurred. And then also objects can be experienced as wounded. So for example, the things in a place where people were murdered or a person was murdered, a clairsentient mystic can sense that woundedness. And the purpose of clairsentience is to develop discernment. In other words, to know the difference between the real and the unreal. And the ultimate goal for clairsentience is a kind of teaching that helps people cut through their illusions by learning to discern between the real and the unreal. So with empaths, as I mentioned earlier, clairaudience is what they experience in terms of inner sense data. Clear hearing, the ability to receive inner sense data in terms of consciousness and relationship, or beings and needs. And what this means is being able to sense the needs of other humans and non-humans, in particular pets. So for example, being able to know when your pet needs water or needs to go outside. Food is usually a pretty obvious one, but sometimes there are much subtler energetic cues. Also, physical and non-physical beings, an example of the non-physical type being dead loved ones. Again, these are all about relationships, relationships with pets, relationships with those who have passed on. The particular ability of empaths is to embrace, overlap, or merge with others. It's as if they can extend their energy field to include another person in relationship. This can even include the experience of mediumship or channeling, which means communication between realms and beings, and can involve an overlap between the medium and some other being. That's called overlighting in spiritualism. By realms, I mean, say, the realm of the devas, the angels, as opposed to the human communicator or channel. And the purpose of all of this is healing, making whole. That's the literal meaning of the word healing, to make things whole. If you think about suffering in terms of being needful, and needfulness as in some way diminishing the fullness of our humanity, then anyone who's involved with alleviating suffering through satisfying the true needs of others is healing that individual or making that individual whole again, or pointing that individual towards a higher level of wholeness as a human being. Now, clairvoyance for seers involves clear seeing, the ability to perceive inner sense data in terms of information and imagery, or systems and parts. Obviously, these things would involve the subtle bodies, the auras around those bodies, or the energy fields around them, the chakras, which are the called by Annie Besant, for example, the organs of our spiritual bodies. Also, the planes and subplanes of the universe or system in which we live, especially the scenes, dwellers, and phenomena, which are all things that the seer will perceive in terms of imagery. An example of scenes, dwellers, and phenomena could be the human afterlife or the Deva realms. Frequently, clairvoyants will also be astral projectors because they have an ability to travel between these realms and observe what's going on there. And the purpose for them of developing such abilities is guiding, so that they can show the way for beings who need to know what the next step in their growth might be. Now, for those of you who may see that you've got abilities along more than one line, I just wanted to point out that each of these circles is our starting point, and that as we grow and develop spiritually, we'll eventually overlap with the abilities of another type. And the ideal is to develop the abilities of all three types. That puts us in the center here. So I would call somebody who's only got one of these types a probably not very reliable psychic or spiritual teacher. Somebody who's got two is going to be more reliable, but the most reliable are going to be the ones in this center spot. Whatever your type, though, that colors how you experience the world. So in a sense, you'll always be an empath or a mystic or a seer with the other abilities added on. Now here comes the opportunity to speak to you about the tie-in with Theosophy. Those of you who have done some study of how the universe developed will recognize the words that I'm showing here on this slide. The divine or the absolute emanates into three different focuses, I'll call them, called first logos, second logos, and third logos. The word logos comes from Neoplatonism, and it refers both to mind, so here we come back to the divine mind, but also to a creative word, an expression or outflow of the divine mind. And this is perhaps why they are called emanations. In Christian religion, this same Trinity is expressed as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, it's expressed as Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. And in the Theosophical teachings, as will, wisdom, and activity, but sometimes the words power, love, and creation are also used in association with will, wisdom, and activity. I'd like to mention, if you want to know more about these terms and how they function within the creation of our universe, a good place to start is The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, especially the first 120 pages or so, but also several books by Annie Besant, The Ancient Wisdom, Esoteric Christianity, and A Study in Consciousness, all discuss the creation of the universe in terms of these three logoi. That's the plural for logos. So now let's look at how this ties in with what I was saying earlier about the three psychic types. We've got our emanations, we've got the theosophical words for them. We have the three aspects of the divine mind that I was talking about earlier. Omnipotence is the aspect that goes with will and power in the first logos. Omnipresence is that of love, wisdom, and goes with the second logos. And omniscience is that of creation activity and goes with the third logos. If you want to think about an outflow into our universe from the three logoi, you could say that energy comes from will, consciousness comes from wisdom, and information comes from activity. And the manifestation of these things as they show up in our universe, with the first logos, it's the powers and the laws of the universe. With the second logos, it's the beings and needs of the universe. With the third logos, it's the systems and the parts of the universe. And if you want to bring in the seven principles, the top three, as taught by Blavatsky and the Mahatmas, then we have spirit or Atman as an expression of the first logos, buddhi or higher heart as an expression of the second, and manas or mind as an expression of the third. Now, as we come into the human realm, these things tend to manifest as spirit as transcendence, heart as unity, and mind as discovery. And this brings us to the mystic, the empath, and the seer. And what I want to point out here is the mystic, as I already explained, was connected with energy, but is also connected with omnipotence, the empath with omnipresence, and the seer with omniscience. Sometimes these things that I've been talking about show up in places you wouldn't expect them. This is a famous mantra by Annie Besant. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May each who feels themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. So in the next few slides, I want to point out how life, light, and love are all involved with that schema I was just showing you. So in much theosophical literature from the period of Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbeater, you'll see information about two paths. And it's the path of the mystic versus the path of the occultist. And I think there are really three. What's called the path of the mystic, I think, is very similar to what I've been describing in terms of a mystic. The occultist could probably apply to all three paths, but more to the seer, and somehow the empathic path got left out. But I'll try to explain now how these three paths work and maybe are a bit more comprehensive. So the path of the seer is involved with this first phrase, "O hidden life, vibrant in every atom." It's literally information experienced as the life in something, but also the vibration of something. In science, everything is determined on the basis of vibration. So for example, we have heat as vibration, sound as vibration, color as vibration, X-rays as vibration, and there's a scale of those different qualities of vibration. In the Theosophical universe, every individual being also has a vibration. Their life is a vibration. It's their special frequency. It's how they are identified, for example, and what their evolutionary path is. That can be determined by someone who's sensitive to the vibration of any particular being. So I think of this path of the seer as the discovery, or discovery as the study of all systems and parts of matter, bodies, realms, and planes. And it's the activity aspect of God, specifically focused on developing manas, mind. And it could be thought of as moving towards oneness within the universe of time, for a reason that will become clear in a moment. The nature of omniscience as knowing the past origin, present place, and future goal of all evolving beings. And the tools for this, for the seer, are precognition, clairvoyance, and the Akashic records, which is the record of all history and of the reincarnational history of any particular being. So you see now why I've linked this idea of the seer's path with oneness within the universe of time. So in these three paths, the empath deals with the phrase, "O hidden love, embracing all in oneness." And this is consciousness as love and embracing. It's also unity as living in right relationship to all beings and needs on the ladder of inclusion that I discussed earlier. It could be said that it's the wisdom aspect of God and that it helps us to develop buddhi or intuition. And here we have oneness in the universe of space instead of time. I think of omnipresence, therefore, as sensing the needs of all beings sharing space in the present eternal moment. Now, what the present is depends on your level of spiritual development and the expandedness of your consciousness. So if you're only accessing the physical plane, it's the beings that are alive in the present moment in time that will be your focus. But as you ascend through the planes, time tends to become more and more an eternal moment. So that if you're living from the Buddhic level of being, it's virtually an eternal now moment. In any case, omnipresence is our ability to sense the needs of all beings sharing space in whatever level we have access to of this eternal moment. And the tools of the empaths are intuitive ethics, along the lines that I was speaking about when I was talking about Annie Besant earlier. Clairaudience, which we've already discussed, is sensing the needs of others. And healing, which is addressing those needs, healing the suffering that those needs may be causing. So in these three paths, the path of the mystic is related to the last of these phrases that we'll be discussing, "O hidden light shining in every creature." So here, energy is described as light or shining. It could be spoken of as transcendence, the drive to overcome all limitations, powers, and laws to reach that light. So think of the source of all being, the divine mind, as the spring that a river flows from. And now you've got mystics, sort of like salmon, trying to navigate that stream to get up to the place where they can mate and reproduce the home, so to speak, that they originated from, and overcoming all the different limitations that are involved in that journey, the rocks, the dams, and so on. This is the will aspect of God developing Atman, highest self. And here we have oneness beyond the universe of space and time, because this is the transcendent aspect of God. So I think then of omnipotence as perceiving the Dharma, the truth, the law, not only of the universe, but of beings, and cutting through the illusions of all beings for the purpose of developing and teaching self-mastery, their sentience, the ability to sense energy states, and discernment that comes from telling the difference between the real and the unreal energy states. And then the goal of the seer is to become a soul guide. So now I'm going to talk about the end result of aspiring to be like the divine mind in terms of omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. So the goal of the seer is to become a soul guide by discovering the true functions of all systems and parts in order to lead each unit of existence into, through, and beyond the next body and realm of its evolutionary journey back to oneness with Source. And the goal of the empath is to become what could be called a soul doctor by experiencing unity within ever larger collectives of beings and needs in order to heal each unit of existence of the wounds of separation sustained on its evolutionary journey back to oneness with Source. The original wound, of course, is our being, in a sense, cast out of the Source with the task of evolving back to oneness with it. But in our interactions with other beings, there's usually a lot of fear and friction involved with separateness. And so these things are what the soul doctor heals. And what I mean by ever larger collectives are the steps on the ladder of inclusiveness. The goal of the mystic is to become a soul teacher by transcending the illusory limitations of all powers and laws in order to show each unit of existence the distinction between real and unreal on its evolutionary journey back to oneness with Source. So how is this done? Let's bring together the ideas of ethical magic and magical ethics. Annie Besant makes a distinction between psychic development and spiritual unfoldment. And I consider psychic development to be problematically ethical and problematically magical, because often the results are harmful to others and sometimes to oneself. So very quickly, we're going to compare and contrast these. With psychic development, it tends to be selfish for self alone. It tends to be intentional and willful, driven, power-based, gaining power over others, non-ethical and exclusive in the sense that there's always an issue of superiority and even arrogance. It tends to be conceptual and purely mental in its focus. It's often goal-oriented, even when it's looking for proof. You can see this, for example, in some of the ghost investigation societies that have all this equipment and go around to different supposedly haunted houses and then put their findings up on YouTube. It tends to be forced and uneven, and it's often prone to frustration or overwhelm. Then with spiritual unfoldment, it's practiced unselfishly. It tends to be open-minded and allowing. It's service-based, ethical and inclusive, intuitive in the sense that it tries to work from a higher level of mind than the purely mental, the causal level or the Buddhic level, higher mind or intuitive mind. It tends to be process-oriented or flow-oriented instead of goal-oriented. Development here or unfoldment here tends to be organic and well-rounded. And it's only what's needed and never too much. Because really what happens with psychic development that overwhelms people is pushing, 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 and getting more than they can actually integrate. Whereas with people on the path of spiritual unfoldment, the masters usually have noticed, as it's often said in theosophical literature, they help and support. They try to make sure that you get only what's needed and never too much. And this is what I consider to be the proper way to address issues of ethical magic and magical ethics, spiritual unfoldment. So in conclusion, I'd like to bring back some of the words and phrases that I used in the description of this talk. Nowadays, the word occult denotes the cultivation of hidden powers, possibly to the detriment of self and others, what HPB called the occult arts as opposed to occultism. And occult arts include seeking physical immortality or eternal youth, summoning the dead, practicing ceremonial magic to gain power over people and non-physical beings. Yet, when the Theosophical Society was founded, occultism, the study of the divine mind in nature, was touted as a spiritual practice for developing our highest ideals. To be an occultist required working for the greater good rather than for self alone. This was ethical magic or altruism. The theosophical approach to occultism developed a system of magical ethics to support such altruistic practice, showing us how to place ourselves in right relationship with our hidden powers and those of the universe. The goal was to become ever more godlike through service to all beings. If you want to know more about this approach to magical ethics, I suggest reading HPB's The Key to Theosophy. Perhaps it's time to restore the high calling of being an occultist. And what I mean by that is to become soul teachers, soul doctors, soul guides. And of course, I have to end my talk with this wonderful painting, The Path from 1895 by Reginald Makell. And one of the reasons I'm using this for today's talk is because the ladder of inclusion that I was talking about is actually illustrated here. You've got physical reality down in the bottom. You've got suffering humanity here. You've got an aspiring soul, hopefully becoming a soul teacher, soul doctor, or soul guide. You've got other higher level beings supporting and guiding that individual. You've got the goal, some kind of highly evolved spiritual master, and you've got an archangel embracing the entire universe of this quest. So thank you very much for attending my talk, and I look forward to your questions.